This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so yesterday, since like a couple of days, we were looking at virtual machine services and we were provisioning virtual machines. We said what is load balancer in virtual machines, and we installed IIS in virtual machines. We did a couple of things out here. But one thing that we haven't discussed out here yet is that how do you automate the creation of a virtual machine infrastructure? Because if you look at things around here, when I start creating a virtual machines, there are a couple of things that I face. So when I say create a virtual machine out here, there are a couple of fields that I need to go through in order to provision one virtual machine. And it will take me somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes of time in order to understand what exactly that I need, which location, what is the networking, etc. And there are a couple of things that we need to decide before creating the virtual machine. So let's say I'll just open my notepad out here. There are a couple of things basically, or a couple of mandatory fields that we need to basically fill in before we go ahead and create a virtual machine out. And they are something like this. Firstly, the name of the virtual machine. And the second thing that you need to fill is, let's say, something like the RG. Okay. Third is, let's say, the location of the resource of the virtual machine. So where you're creating the virtual machine, etc. Fourth, very importantly, is the size of the virtual machine that you need to create. So for example, the size of the VM, which series of the virtual machine that you want to create, how big or how small of a virtual machine that you want to create, and etc. Fifth, I would say, is going according to this particular screen. It is, let's say, the networking. So I'm saying, okay, fine, you need a networking, you need a virtual network, and you need a subnet inside the virtual network, right? So a couple of things out here. And after that, you go into something known as a management page, wherein you can say whether you need a public IP or not. So let's say public IP. And seven, I would say finally, you would decide something known as NSGs, Network Security Group Rule, when you're creating a virtual machine service using the Azure portal is what I'm talking about. So NSGs, and you say, okay, fine, I need a port called 80, I need a port called 443. I also want to do an RDP into this machine, so I need a port called 3389. You basically select all these ports, and then finally you hit the review and create button. You get a validation, that validation gets passed. After that, you can go ahead and create this virtual machine service out here. Now, one thing that I want to just call out before we go ahead and create a virtual machine service is that I just want to go ahead and review back again what is the order in which the infrastructure is getting provided, because this is very, very important. So let's open up our virtual machine diagram and let's go to the first classes of virtual machine to understand what I'm really talking about out here. So let me open up the virtual machines, the classes out here, and let's see about this. Let's look at this out. So this is the virtual machine architecture that we were talking about since the very beginning of our discussion on virtual machines. And we said the order of creation is something like this. The very first thing, meaning in order for me to create a public IP, this public IP can be created as an independent resource. I don't have to declare any kind of a dependencies, meaning in order for me to create a public IP, I don't need to tell, okay, fine, the public IP depends upon something else. That's an independent resource. I can just go ahead and declare it out, or I can just go ahead and create it out independently. So is the network security group rule. I don't have to declare, or I don't have to really say that I need a pre-existing resource before I can go ahead and create something known as a network security group rule. Next thing is coming as something known as a virtual network. And in order to create a virtual network, this particular virtual network should only be created if there is a network security group rule in place. The reason being, I am attaching this particular network security group rule to the subnet of the virtual machine or to the subnet of the virtual network, so that whatever VMs gets provisioned inside this particular subnet will follow the same energy rules, will follow the same set of rules. So that's the reason I'm saying that, okay, fine, you know what, in order to create a virtual network, I will need a pre-existing energy resource. So even when you see the portal, even when, let's say, when you're trying to create all these resources in the portal, the very first thing that gets created is either a public IP or an energy. So let's say public IP and then energy gets created. Then you have the virtual network that is getting created. Then you have the subnet inside the virtual network that is getting created. And while the subnet is getting created, this subnet is getting attached to the network security group rule. That's how the order of creation is actually going around when you're doing it on the Azure portal. Third, I have the NIC card, which is the most important component. And in my case, I need my virtual machine to have public IP. So I will need the NIC card to have a public IP indirectly, because NIC card is a resource that gets, let's say, or that's basically having the property of a public IP and a private IP. Now the question here for y'all is that I'll give you a couple of statements out here. Please tell that, if my statement is right or wrong. I will say that my NIC card, if my NIC card needs to be created, it should definitely have a public IP. Is it right? Is it right to tell that way? Yes, no, maybe. Anyone? So the statement that
No,
I'm telling is that, I'm sorry, yes, please go ahead.
no,
No, correct. My NIC card can or cannot have a public IP. Second is that my NIC card can or cannot have a private IP. Is that right? Yes, no, maybe.
yes,
So, no, the NIC card should have a private IP definitely, because your NIC card cannot be created without a private IP address that's getting attached to it. So it should have private IP when especially you're creating the NIC card and then attaching it later to a virtual machine, because a virtual machine cannot exist without a virtual network. So you need definitely a private IP that is attached to your NIC card. That's the reason in my architecture I am saying my NIC card needs a public IP, because I am creating a virtual machine which is public in nature. So I will say that the creation of the NIC card depends upon two things out here. One being the public IP, one being the private IP. The second being the private IP, which is coming from the subnet. So my, my NIC card inherits a public IP and my NIC card inherits a private IP that is coming from the subnet out here. Finally, I have a virtual machine that is getting created. So if I were to put it in very simple terms, this is how I would put my architecture in. The very first resource that I would create is a public IP. The second resource that I would create is a network security group rule. Third, what I would create is a virtual network and a subnet inside the virtual network. And I will attach the subnet to, let's say, the what do you say, the energy basically card or the energy resource that I'm creating out here, because I need all my virtual machines that are created inside this particular subnet to take the rule of the energy. So I would say NSG and attach it to virtual machine. So attach it to the virtual network. So the virtual network depends upon this particular resource, right? Does everyone agree to it? The creation of the virtual network itself depends on the creation of the network security group rule. Finally, I would say number four is my NIC card. My NIC card now has a public and a private IP, so I'll attach the public and a private IP to the NIC card. So the creation of the NIC card is dependent upon the creation of one, which is a public IP, three, which is the subnet, which gives the NIC card a private IP address. Then finally, five, I would say a virtual machine service. and my virtual machine is dependent upon the creation of a NIC card. Guys, getting this? Any questions with this, guys? If you're not understanding it, please let me know, because once we are automating things out, these concepts are very, very important. This architecture, this dependency is very important. And it's not like a storage account that we are creating using an ARM template. Storage account was a very straightforward resource using an ARM or a PowerShell. It was pretty simple, but virtual machines needs this understanding. So guys, is this okay? Does anyone have any questions with this particular arrangement? Anyone, anything? So with that, let's do one thing. Since I have this particular arrangement out here, so I'll say this is the order of creation. So let's understand how to design a ARM template accordingly. So I am inside the VS Code. I have just opened up a skeleton of an ARM template. How did I do it? I just selected the language called ARM. Then I said ARM exclamation, and I got the entire skeleton. So this is the skeleton of the ARM template that I have. So it's a blank template that I do have. In this, I don't need the functions, so I'll just remove the functions block. Neither do I need something known as the output, so I'll just remove this block as well. Now inside the resources, when we were creating a storage account, we just typed in ARM-storage. Let me load this out. Give me a second. Now this is going to take a minute, so let's give it a minute out here. Okay. So if I were to create a storage account service, I would just type storage and the storage account would be provided. Now I want to create a VM. So I'll say VM. Let's say hyphen and then VM. And I want to create a VM which is of a Windows type. So I'll just enter this out and I'm getting an entire block of code which is telling me, or which is rather giving me an idea on how to create a virtual machine service using an ARM template. Now I just need to basically play around with these blocks, and I just need to make sure that I parameterize things so that it is dynamic in nature. My template is dynamic in nature. So this will be my approach. So the first thing, let's approach this in one after the other. So I'll just collapse everything firstly, and let's work on one resource after the other so that it will help us to follow along. And please stop me if you don't understand anything. Now, the first resource that's ever getting created is a storage account. Now, why do we need a storage account to be created along with the virtual machine service? Can anyone tell me? Do we need a storage account firstly to create a virtual machine? Yes, no, maybe. Okay, so why do we need it? Anyone, guys, online, offline, anyone? The first thing that's getting created is a storage account out here when I approach a template. Now, why do I need this? Anyone?
It is a mandatory thing, Kiran.
Okay, so when you created a virtual machine using the portal, did you see a storage account getting created?
By default, some storage account C drive, it will come automatically, right, sir?
I'm sorry.
We need any no. By default, some storage account.
Yes, but when
Sorry.
I use the portal and create it, did you see any storage account getting created anytime?
No.
Then why is it mandatory then? Let's go here. Let's understand this firstly. And let me open the portal up. So I am here in the creation of a virtual machine service. And whenever we are creating a virtual machine service, let me do this. Let me go and give a couple of things here. I won't create this out. East US, and let's say something like Windows Server 2019, and the size is available. Let's see. Uh, okay, let's see if I have any services. Okay, great. Let's do one thing. Let's change the location to Central US. And I'm giving a couple of things like the whatever we do. I'm just giving all these things out here. And let's go to disks. Premium disk is okay. Networking is okay. Management is okay. And in here, do you see this option called boot diagnostics? And I said that okay, fine, we'll disable this for now. And I said that boot diagnostics is just, let's say, an additional tool which will help you understand what's happening with your virtual machine if it's crashing. So if I say enable, do you see it says enable with a managed storage account? And it says enable with a managed storage account recommended, and it is telling me that okay, fine, if you want to go for a custom storage account you can, or you can disable this out. And if I say enable, if I just scroll down here, okay, not scroll down, let's say enable with a custom storage account, do you see something called the storage account getting reflected out here? It's saying I want a new storage account out here in order to store all the logs that come from your virtual machine if it were to crash. And if I say I don't need a boot diagnostic for now because to avoid the creation of a storage account, it's not asking me anywhere to go ahead and create a storage account out here. And that's the reason we did not see any storage account getting created while you were creating a virtual machine service. In here, they are only provisioning a storage account out here for the reason, if I just open up the creation of a virtual machine out here in the bottom, and if I just scroll down, the boot diagnostics enabled is true, meaning they want to enable the boot diagnostics. And in my case, I don't need the boot diagnostics to be enabled. So instead of a true, I'll make it false. So I don't need the storage account at all. I don't need my storage account service at all. I can avoid creating this resource. How can I do that? I can just say remove this out. I'm just removing the entire block out, and I'm saying I don't need the storage account in the first place at all because I'm not using the storage account service for my boot diagnostics. So I'm just getting rid of that. And finally, or the next or the second thing that I'm working on, can anyone tell me what this resource is by looking at it? It's a public IP because the type of the resource out here is Microsoft.network / public IP addresses. And then it's telling it is Windows VM public IP. Now I don't want, or I rather don't like the name to be like this. I want to parameterize this out. So I would say this is parameters public IP name or public IP address. This is the parameter that I want to declare, and I haven't declared the parameter anywhere. So I will just copy this parameter, go into the parameters block, and I will say since I have declared and not be since I'm using and I'm not declared anywhere, I'll say new parameter. I'll place the name of this particular parameter. It's a string, and by default I will give it a value called, let's say, ARM hyphen PIP, public IP. Since this is being created from something like the ARM template, I'm telling, okay, fine, this is an ARM and this is, let's say, a public IP address out here. Coming down, so it's telling the type is something like ARM.network. I mean, the type is something like Microsoft.network for such public IP addresses. The location I'm taking from the resource group. So I'm saying wherever my resource group is there, please go ahead and create let's say a public IP in that particular location. I'm good with this. And I'm saying the public IP allocation method is a dynamic. And there is something known as a DNS name label. We'll look into that. We'll look into that in the very last of everything. So for now, I'll just leave the DNS label the way it is. So I'll just leave it the way it is. And I'll just minimize this particular block. So I am done with the public IP and I'll come back to, let's say, something known as the DNS name label out here. Let's understand this a bit further. So I'll just collapse this out, come down to the NSG. Now, how do you know it's an NSG? Because it is Microsoft.network/network security groups. And since this is NSG, I also want to parameterize this out. So I'll say parameters NSG name. And since I haven't declared the parameter anywhere, it's throwing an error. So I'll just go up and I'll say, okay, fine, you know what? After this parameter, I also need another parameter which is called NSG name, which is nothing but a string. And the default value is something like ARM NSG. This is the name of the network security group rule that I want to create. And automatically the error is getting disappeared because I've declared the parameter value. And inside this, again, you have something known as the API version, which is okay. I'm not disturbing this I'm not doing anything here. And there is something known as location, and the location is being picked up from the resource group. So I'm okay with this. Then you have properties. Then you have inside the property something known as security rule. And what is this symbol, guys? The square bracket in an ARM template? It's an array, meaning I can define multiple rules out here. And the first rule out here is called NSG rule 1. I don't want to tell it as NSG rule 1. I'll say allow an RDP. This is an RDP connection. I'm saying here I'll just give a description telling that allowing RDP. And I will say the port is 3389. Very importantly, there are a couple of things that I need to declare. First thing is the port, the access whether allow or deny, the direction whether inbound rule or is it an outbound rule. Very importantly, something known as a priority. Each and every rule has a priority number associated with it. So for example, like we'll talk about priorities once we are doing NSGs in networking in detail. We'll understand what priorities, but let's understand this in a bit detail. Now I also want a HTTP rule for port 80 because this is a web server that I want to create. So I'm just copying this particular property and I'm saying, okay, fine, you know what? From here is where my rule block is starting. So I'll copy the entire thing till line number 57. This is the entire block. Paste it again. Now I'll say it is not allow RDP, but this is allow HTTP. And the port number, guys, what should be the port number for HTTP? 80. So I'll just change it to not 80. So I won't put it as 3389. I'll say this is 80. Direction is inbound. And very importantly, no two rules can have the same priority number. This cannot happen. So what I will do out here is that I'll change the rule number here to something like 110. Now the thing here is that the lesser the priority of the rule, the higher is the importance of the rule. So if I have a rule at 3389 at sitting at priority 100, Microsoft Azure will first execute this particular block and will say, okay, fine, this user wants to allow RDP at 100, which is good, which is the first priority. Second, he wants to also allow HTTP at 110 if I have another rule saying something like this. So if I just copy this out, or I have already copied something, so I'll just paste something out here. I will say deny RDP, same RDP out here. I'll say this is access is not allowed but deny, and the priority number is 200. So what I'm doing out here is that I am allowing RDP at a priority call 100, which is taking the highest order of precedence. If I just come down, I am denying RDP at 200. What happened? Let's give a second. I'm denying RDP at 200. Now this rule will not even get executed because you will have a greater rule out here, which is called allow RDP, that is sitting at port 100, which will take a precedence over the rule 200. So the lesser the priority number, the greater is the precedence, or the greater is the importance of that particular rule. So what I'll do here is that I don't need this. So I'll just, for example, I just put it here. So I'll just delete this out and make a couple of corrections here. This is not allowing RDP, this is allowing HTTP, and I am good. So I just need two rules. You can add multiple, you can add inbound, outbound, and etc. So I'm just adding two rules out here and I can just collapse this entire network security group rule. So if you want, let's say the outbound rules, very simple. You can just take this, for example, I also need an outbound rule for HTTP. So I'll just click here at line number 58. It'll highlight where it is closing. At line number 71, it's closing. I'll just copy the entire block, paste it here, and I'll say allow HTTP, and I'll say outbound. And say allowing HTTP outbound traffic. Priority now should be something like, let's say 120. Say this is outbound. So the direction is outbound. So the direction can be either inbound or outbound. And the port number should be 80 because it's a HTTP rule that I'm creating right now. And the rule name should also be different. For RDP, I'm saying it's allow RDP. For HTTP, I'm saying allow HTTP. And finally, I'm saying HTTP allow out. So now I can just collapse the entire network security group rule out here. And let me go to the next thing, which is the creation of a virtual network itself. So let's come here again. Public IP I've created, done. The energy I've created, done. The creation of a virtual network, it depends upon the creation of the network security group rule, very importantly. So that's how do I basically establish a dependency between my subnet and the network security group rule? How do I establish that kind of a thing out here? So let's understand this firstly. I have a name. I'll parameterize my name. So firstly, I'll do this. I'll go here and I will say this is not something like this, but this is parameters vnet name, and I will just use a parameter like this, and I'll create a vnet name out here. So I'll say new parameter. Is this parameter here called vnet name, and I'll say the default value is something like ARM vnet. This is the default value, and I'll say just give it a comma here. Come down, and the error should be disappearing. And the second thing is that the type Microsoft.network / virtual networks is the type of the resource that I'm creating. Location again is the resource group.location. Finally, I have a block called depends on, and it says it depends upon the resource ID of the Microsoft.network / network security group rules, comma, the earlier name of the network security group rule that was there. This is how I establish a dependency between one resource and the other, meaning this resource called vnet will only be created if this resource called network security group rule already exists. And for this resource to be existing, it should be created first. That's how now your ARM template will now understand, okay, fine, what is the resource dependency? How do I end up creating them? What is the order of creation out here? But there is one issue out here. The name, the, sorry, the name is not something like VM1-NSC. I have changed the name. It is ARM-NSC, and the name is declared in the parameter section. So what will I do here is that I'll just remove everything here. I'll just reconstruct this entire block. So I'll just show you how to do that. So you can, this is how it will look like, depends upon, I'll say in quotes, open up a square bracket, resource ID of, you need the resource ID of the network security group rule. I'll say yes, this is the one, comma, parameters NSG name. Because my network security group rule is now declared in the parameter section. So that's how I am declaring this out. So I'm, I'm saying resource ID of the network security group rule, and please also go to the parameters block and take the name of the NSG. So this is how I'm declaring it. And then you have tags which is called display name, which is okay. Most importantly, I have something called as an address prefix block, wherein I'm declaring what is the address space of the virtual network. So I'm not okay with this. I don't want a 10.0.0.0. I rather will take something like 192.168.0.0/16. This is the address block that I will take. Finally, I I have something known as the subnets. It's an array, meaning you can create multiple subnets within this virtual network. And I am saying this is one of the subnets, and the name of the subnet is not this. I'll say it is parameters subnet name. Declare a parameter for this, let's say in the beginning. And I will say the name, the default value is something like ARM subnet. This coming down, the subnet block is fixed, and the address prefix. Is this correct, guys? Or should I
No,
make any change? Yeah, so what should be the address prefix out here?
196.
It is a
192.
192 address space. The reason being, my VNet is this address 192.168. I cannot have my subnet sitting in an address called 10.0.0. This is not okay with me. So that's the reason I'll just go ahead and change the address space to something like, okay, come here, something like 192.168.0.0/24. This is the address space in which I want to I want to make sure to create my subnet in. And finally, I want my subnet to get attached, or I want the network security group rule to get attached to the subnet, and I'm calling it using the ID of the network security group rule. But I need to also fix this, so I'll just remove this out and I'll say parameters NSG name. This is how the ID is constructed. So whatever was there here, you can just also copy and paste it out here. My network security group rule, or so let's say my virtual network block, is fixed right now. So I'll just minimize this out. I now go into, let's say, something known as virtual network interface. And my virtual network interface to be created depends upon 1 and 3. 1 and 3 were what? Public IP, public IP. 3 is a virtual network and the subnet inside the virtual network. And it needs a public IP address and a private IP address out here. So what I'm doing out here is that I'll say this is parameters again, NIC card name or NIC card. Let's copy this out, create a new parameter for my own self. So I'm just doing the same thing out here. and I'll give it a default value called NIC card or called ARM NIC. Finally go down here and now let's see this. Name is being picked up from parameters NIC card, which is good enough. Type is Microsoft.network forward slash network interfaces. API version is okay. Location is also okay. And now it it depends upon two things. One is a public IP address. The second is the virtual network. But I've changed the name of the public IP address. This is not the name. So I'll have to make sure to take this out. And I'll say parameters is public IP address. And this is the virtual network. And even this is changed. As the parameters, virtual network name, VNet name. So I'm changing this out. You don't need tags out here. So I'll just remove the tag. Or you can have a tag, not a problem. It's not hurting anything. It's not hurting anything. And finally, I'm saying properties and I'm saying IP configuration. This is where I declare what is the public IP and what is the private IP. How do I do that? I'll say public IP address and I'm and I'm giving the ID of the public IP address out here. So in here, I have the entire resource ID block. So I'll just remove this out and let me reconstruct it. I'm saying this is public IP addresses, comma, parameters public IP address. And since the private IP address is coming from the subnet, I'm saying this is the subnet and the ID of the subnet is something like this. Microsoft.network forward slash virtual networks forward slash subnets, the name of the virtual network, comma, the name of the subnet of the virtual network. This is how I'm declaring the ID. So let me reconstruct this block once again. I'll say it is Microsoft.network forward slash virtual network forward slash subnets, comma, parameters VNet name, comma, parameter subnet name. This is how I'm constructing the entire resource ID of the subnet inside a virtual network. Finally, I would say the virtual machine, which is, let's say, the last resource that's getting created here. So I'll say the name is not this, but this is parameters VM name. And I'll give a name. I'll give a name to the VM here. I'll say it is ARM VM. And the type is something like this. It's Microsoft.compute forward slash virtual machines. This is how the name is. And it has a dependency. It's dependent upon the Microsoft.storage account. But do we need this here? Are we creating a storage account? So I'll remove this out. But it definitely needs to depend upon the network interface. So I'll say it is the resource ID of the Microsoft.network forward slash network interfaces, comma, the name of the network interface. The name of the network interface that is getting created. So I'll say it is parameters NIC name. This is the name of the network interface card which is getting created. And very importantly, it says hardware profile and then the VM size. Now I'm creating this in a central US location. So I just need to see what is the size that is available out here because this is a free subscription and the size that is available out here is standard underscore B2S. This is the size that is there. So I'll say this is not A2. I'll say this standard underscore B2S. This is the size that is available. and the computer name can be the same name as the virtual machine, or should be the same name as the virtual machine. So I'll say this parameters VM name. Then you have two particular parameters out here, which is called admin username and the admin password. I'll say test user hyphen 001. And finally, it's telling me what is the hardware reference, meaning what is the image that you want to create. In my case, this is not a 2012 server. It's a 2019 hyphen data center, which is the latest one. And I'm saying this is the ID of the network interface. So whatever is there, I'm just editing this out. I'll say it is resource ID of the network interfaces, comma, parameters NIC card name. And finally, I don't need the boot diagnostics, do I? So instead of true, I'll say this is false. And I'll just take this out. This is how I'm creating the entire template. End to end, this is how I'm creating the entire template. One final thing that I want to just call out is that during the creation of the public IP address, I said there is something known as domain name label. So let's see this. Let's understand what this is. So I'll just go here in the Azure portal. I'll just say public IP addresses. I'll say create a new public IP address here. The IPv4 standard regional. Then you have something known as the name. I'll say this is the test the IP address. And you have something known as a domain name. Meaning, if I give a domain name here, something like test PIP address, you will have a URL that is getting created for this particular public IP. Instead of, let's say, using the IP address directly, you can use something known as the domain name label, which is test public IP address dot eastus2 dot cloudapp dot azure.com, which is something known as a fully qualified domain name of a public IP address. So instead of calling the IP every time, you can call this particular URL, which will point out to the same IP. And domain name labels are important when you create, let's say, from an ARM template, and they have to be unique in nature. So that's the reason I'll say that instead of this particular value, I want to add whatever is the name of my public IP address, which is ARM-PIP, with something known as DNS. So my public IP address should look something like, or the DNS of the public IP address should look something like ARM-PIP DNS, something like this. So that's the reason I'll say one cat, meaning add two things, and I'll add parameters public IP address name with something known as DN with something known as DNS or DN, like something like this. So I'm just binding two strings out here, and I'm saying this is the domain name label and this is how it should be, and I'll say save, and I'll say this is vmarm.json, not plain text. I'm sorry. I'll just save this out once again. Let me go into the location out here. So I just need a JSON file here, so I don't need the text document. This is not the right format. I just need a JSON file here. And finally, after I created all these things out, let me go back and let me try deploying this template. So I'll use a custom deployment. I said deploy a custom template. Take this out. I'll say build my own template in a text editor, and I'll say load my file, and I'll just go into, let's say, this particular default document, which is .json file. Open this out and load this out, and I'll say save. Now if you see, you have everything that's getting created. Location is not West US, it is Central US. And I'll say create, and I'll just create a resource group called demo VM ARM, and I'll say okay. Finally, we'll say review and create this out. So it's just running a final validation, and validation is passed. And once I hit the create button, whatever I did on the Azure portal, I'll be able to achieve it using the ARM template out here. Any questions clear, guys? Now for you all to practice this out, I have placed this file inside this particular repository, and you'll have the entire JSON definition out here. You can use this template as your reference in order to go ahead and build something out. And I'll just give this particular path on the group chat in this particular section. Please make sure to just paste it on the WhatsApp group that you all are on. Okay, so please use this link in order to go through the template. This is a public repository. You don't have to log in or anything like that. You can go into this link and just download the entire template and start working with this. Okay, any questions, guys? Any questions still here? Anyone, any questions? Okay, so please deploy this please deploy this template out and let me know if you get any errors here. Okay, please write this from the scratch so that you'll understand how to write it and how to follow along. So please follow along with the video and start writing this template out. Okay, the guys, then if no further questions, then that's it from my end today. Thank you, and we'll meet tomorrow. Thank you, guys.